I guess, a couple years ago.
Yeah, two and a
Literally,
half years ago.
literally called Nazi Billionaires.
Yes, that's literally what it's called. Yeah.
And from my understanding, you spent like 4 years deep on this, doing
Yeah.
nothing but this research. And I'm going to give the general idea here, but you're going to break it down. Like, you basically traced modern money from major companies, international companies, back to old Third Reich money.
Yeah.
How did you even like get the idea to do this in the
Yeah.
first place?
Yeah. I was a reporter at Bloomberg News in New York, and I was hired on this new team which investigated family offices, family-owned businesses, family, non-stock exchange listed companies, which was really a blind spot for Bloomberg because they really focus on companies that are listed or that are publicly traded on the stock exchange. And they soon and I was hired as a North America reporter, even though I'm Dutch. But soon my American bosses asked me, "Oh, do you want to? Can you cover the German-speaking countries?" They assumed me being Dutch that I spoke fluent German, which
didn't.
I certainly did not at that point. Which, of course, as a 25-year-old reporter, I didn't have the heart, or I didn't dare to tell them. I just said yes and amen, and and went for it.
You go to German classes?
I did not. I did not. I did later. No, I did later before I moved to Germany. But what I did was I would spend a month between Thanksgiving and Christmas. I would spend in the Bloomberg bureaus in Germany, Switzerland, and Austria. And the stories I always came back with were this mix of the financial and the historical and the business side of things. And what really struck me in my reporting was that companies like BMW or Porsche or Audi, mainly car brands, which is really the backbone of the German economy still today, but more importantly, the families that control them today, they would celebrate their fathers and grandfathers for their business successes, but they would leave out any, any mention of their mass war crimes, of their Nazi affiliations, of their SS memberships, after they had purported to have reckoned with these crimes. So there would be, major global foundations named after them, media prizes, museums, academic chairs, corporate headquarters, you name it, celebrating these men without any transparency from where the money came from. And I thought that was such a whitewash of history, such a brazen distortion of history, that I first ended up reporting about it for Bloomberg and a series of articles. And then actually my colleagues said, you should write a book about this. And actually my old boss, Matt, he came up with the title Nazi Billionaires.
It's a great
Already
title.
back in 2017, which really, is very, very to the point, very factual. And I actually ended up leaving Bloomberg in 2017 and moving to Berlin for 4 years and really to immerse myself in the research, in the archival research, interviewing people, trying to talk to these families, but really diving into the history in order to tell the contemporary cover-up story, basically.
Right.
So,
And at this point, you speak pretty good German.
and at that point, so luckily, when I moved to Berlin, which is such a great city, I don't know if either of you have ever been.
I've flown through it. I've never been there.
It's one of my favorite cities on the planet, and luckily for me, I got the group of friends I made that were German, and the Germans, they force you to speak German, so they don't, so I couldn't, initially, I was pretty nervous, so I kept to English, but I soon felt comfortable enough to speak in German, and that sustained me for 4 years, having to work through. It was tough. It was reporting out a book on such a sensitive and secretive topic, while being a native Dutch speaker, writing a book in English based on German sources was was one of the hardest things I've ever did, and I'm very happy with the result. So
Yeah. Now, going back for
yeah,
one sec before we go to the
yeah,
investigation, you mentioned how your issue was the whitewashing of like the current generations,
yeah,
leaving out that part about
yeah,
the older
yeah.
generations, which is interesting because it's all like, and this is a bit of a hypothetical for
Sure,
you,
sure.
but it's almost like, let's say the current generations
Right.
didn't celebrate the old
Yeah,
generations at all.
yeah,
Just kind of was
but
like, they weren't good people.
yeah,
We're here now doing our thing. do you think you would feel differently going into the investigation because there would be like a sense of recognition there that like, all right, this is not something that was good at all, and
Totally. I
Yeah.
mean, either way, I wouldn't have focused on the families I focused on, which ended up coincidentally being what are today Germany's wealthiest and most powerful business dynasties, or some of the world's. Had they not so brazenly or cravenly, championed these men for their business successes and leave out any trace of their war crimes.
Right.
If they had not mentioned it, or if they had been, transparent about it in the first place, I would have never had a chance to write about them. But they, you know, acted with such impunity with regards to kind of the lack of moral responsibility towards history that I thought that I really wanted to shine a light on that. As a journalist, as a European, as a citizen of the world, I thought it was just to kind of uncover their hypocrisy and show that to the world. I thought it was pretty important.
How much had you studied? Alessi, are you having an audio issue over there?
Yeah, I keep hearing it in one.
All right, hold on 1 second, everybody.
Sure.
We'll be right back. All right, sorry about that. We're back. What I was going to ask there before we stopped was, how much had you, been a student of regular World War II
Right.
history and stuff growing up? Was that always like an interest of yours? So you were kind of drawn back to it, or not?
So not as much, actually, I would say, as a particular interest to me. I think my family history, my family has, tens of millions of other European families, right? I mean, they had their own experiences during the war. My grandfather, he was a very avid sailor, and he was 25 years old when he decided to sail to England with his best friend to join the Royal Air Force during World War II. And they were blown back to shore on the second attempt, and they were arrested by German soldiers and sentenced as political prisoners. And he spent 20 months doing slave labor in a German steel factory.
Whoa.
Yeah, and he was a tall Dutch guy, 6'5", and he came out weighing 100 pounds, barely alive.
What's up, guys? If you haven't already, please smash that subscribe button and hit that like button on the video. And if you don't have time to watch this episode right now, I'd really appreciate it if you saved it to your watch later playlist on YouTube. Finally, if you'd like to follow me on Instagram or X, those links are in my description below.
And
Was he in there with like other prisoners of the
Yeah,
state,
yeah,
meaning
he
like
was there.
Jews or anything like that? Or
I mean, that is unclear what their background was. All I know from his stories, and he didn't. I was lucky enough to get to know him till I was 20, and he was really kind of my hero growing up. He was really this kind of,
Yeah.
really, he was super tall and this kind of, proud Dutch patriot, but he really, for him, it was such a traumatizing experience,
I
right?
can imagine.
And, especially what he saw as, the Germans coming in and occupying his country. It's just, and he wasn't, he was Christian, he wasn't, he was persecuted not for his religious beliefs, but he was persecuted because he tried to flee the country,
Sure.
and to then, hopefully liberate his country, right? And he was he went to a sanatorium in Switzerland afterwards, where because he had tuberculosis, he was emaciated, he was barely alive, and I think he always made jokes about the Germans kind of growing up. That was his way to deal with what he'd been through. And he lived in a super small farming village, 300 people in the south of the Netherlands near the beach, where all the Germans would always go. So he would always like make jokes like there's another invasion incoming, but I think that story, and also the story of my other grandparents. My grandfather hid in Amsterdam, center of Amsterdam, for 3.5 years.
He hid there?
Yeah, he hid there because he was Jewish. So he hid there. And my grandmother, together with my 3-year-old aunt, fled to Switzerland, where she was from. And they were with a traveling companion, a painter. And they were arrested by the Gestapo, by the Nazi secret police on the French-Swiss border. And the Gestapo officer took pity on my grandmother and my 3-year-old aunt. Because she, because my aunt was young, and said, "Oh, report back tomorrow," with implicit message, flee tonight. and they
Wow.
made it over the border into Switzerland,
A
which is
Gestapo
neutral.
officer did
Yeah,
this.
yeah.
Whoa.
Yeah. But this companion, our traveling companion, this painter, he reported back the next morning. He was deported and murdered in a death camp. Yeah. So certainly those experiences, right? Both, from both sides of my family, very much informed me about history, and that I think also pushed me to, wanting to have transparency, wanting to give transparency to these histories, right? And I thought it was also kind of this having this, kind of this righteous anger about their cover up, which sustained me doing research for 4 years in German documents. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's some serious ties. Very different experiences as well on both sides. I mean,
Totally. Absolutely.
you can,
Absolutely.
in some ways, like, obviously you didn't live it, but you lived through it. You lived through those experiences because those are people that you were close to in your life.
Absolutely, yeah. Like, I was very lucky enough to get to know 3 of the 4 of my grandparents and hear their stories, and that very much just informed me about history. But it was actually my maternal grandfather, the one who was locked up by the Germans, who was certainly in a way more, I would say, traumatized
Sounds
by
like
it, but also in a way that, but not in a way that hindered him in any way in his life. But he was able to channel it through humor, which I think is the kind of the best remedy if you can do that.
Sure.
Yeah.
And he also, as you explained, seemed to compartmentalize it because he didn't necessarily like
Right.
talking about the experiences, which I can imagine. It's so crazy to me when I sit up sometimes. Like, as I get older, we do get farther away from it. But
Yeah.
still,
Yeah.
we're recording this at the end of 2024.
Yeah.
It is still just 79 years
Yeah.
since, quote unquote, like the
Yeah.
end of this war, which
Yeah.
that means obviously there's people who were still alive. We actually just recorded with 2 World War II
Yeah.
veterans and stuff, which is so cool. But like it's a whole different world
Totally.
technologically, world order wise,
Yeah.
everything. And yet this insanity
Yeah.
that today would be viewed as like, what,
Yeah.
was
Yeah.
happening just
Yeah.
then.
Yeah, totally. And I just gave a talk in Morristown, New Jersey, and I met 100-year-old veteran Sid Levitt, who
Oh, that's
was
cool.
who was like sharp as a razor, and it's just incredible meeting him. And he was part of the liberation of Europe, and thanking him for his service. And I was so impressed by him. And look at my own family now. We have our first enlisted officer. He's a U.S. Marine, and he just deployed to Okinawa.
Whoa.
And yeah, so he's so. As far as I know, it's the first one, particularly in these generations who are serving, who signed up and are serving to protect our country and protect the freedom of the world. So I'm really greatly indebted to that.
I also think sometimes, especially like it gives you perspective. But we got to meet some of them. Obviously, you got to meet
Right.
one as well. But
Yeah.
even when you just listen to some of these guys who are still alive talk, it's like we fight over so much bullshit now
Yeah, we
in
do.
society. And I understand, there's things we got to have progress on and move forward and stuff. And there's going to be political fights. That's always existed. But it's like the perspective of those guys and the guys from England, France, and all the allies who saw like, the bottom of the abyss, so
Yes.
to speak, not that long ago.
Yeah.
It's always important to me to remember that because it's like they get, and your grandparents understood the difference between like that fine line between like literal freedom and you're done. Everyone can just die.
Yeah.
And sometimes in society, I feel like we lose that perspective because we cry wolf on every
Totally.
issue and we ignore the issues that actually, maybe could devolve to something like that.
Yeah, we take things for granted so much, and we're also in that sense, particularly, I would say, in Western Europe and maybe other parts of the West, we're a bit spoiled in that sense
Yes.
of taking our freedoms.
Agreed.
And our liberty for granted. And that's something, the story of my family is the story of tens of millions of other Europeans, and of millions of Americans who helped liberate Europe or settled in the U.S. after the war, and it is these are micro stories of my family, right? But this is a story that tens of millions of families have all across the world.
Absolutely. Now, when you came into Bloomberg, you were saying that they put you on like the family office track and
Yeah.
all that and trying to investigate the money
Yeah.
that's not on the public exchanges, which to me is really fascinating. And I want to make sure everyone else out there can
Yeah.
appreciate that and follow that. So just so you know a little bit of my background, I came from Wall Street before
Right.
I did this. So I'm not a family office expert,
Right.
but it's something I came into
course.
contact with sometimes, you know, with some of the money that was sloshing around. And it was always so fascinating to me because it was like this ivory tower kind of
Right.
system.
Yeah, it
You'd
is,
have
eh?
you'd just have like this little family tree, and it's like, oh, they have their own
Right thing.
set of people
Yeah.
working on
Yeah.
something. And
Yeah.
of course, it sounds like a Bond movie every time. That's not necessarily the case. But like when you were going to look into this, like how do you investigate
Yeah.
or report on family offices?
Yeah, yeah. Back when I started, you know, this was late 2011, November 2011. Actually, the week of Thanksgiving 2011. So exactly 13 years to the week, and you know, there was the family office space was pretty nascent at the time. You know, it was not, it didn't get the, you know, the scrutiny that it gets today, or it's not as big as an industry as it is, you know, 13 years on, right? But you know, at the time, you would meet with, you know, it's what journalists do. You say, hey, you know, I'm new to this beat. Can I meet so and so? You know, and I think especially when you work for Bloomberg, you know,
Sure.
you get a foot in the door. People want to talk to you, either on the record, on background, off the record. You know, you get an insight into an industry, which is indeed very closed off and secretive. But now, the family offices have grown so big, right? Look at, you know, Elon Musk or any of or Zuckerberg or any of these guys or you know, families. You know, they team up with a lot of private equity firms to do
Yes.
big deals, right? So it's become more and more public as a force of nature, and also in deal making, in like a lot big deal making, big mergers and acquisitions or takeovers, rather than just, you know, building the money, you know, building out or sustaining, you know, multi-generational wealth. Through investing in stocks or in bonds and real estate and private equity and hedge funds and you name it, right? Or art. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, art's a huge one
Yeah,
too.
huge class.
I still don't
Totally.
understand all
Yeah.
that because it's
No.
like
Yeah.
you have it just so you can hide it for taxes and you don't enjoy it, but it's somewhere in a warehouse and that's on your balance sheet.
Yeah, which is like sad, right? I mean, you should, if you buy beautiful art, you should hang it up on
Yeah.
the wall. Right?
Yeah, Steve Cohen hangs it on his wall.
Exactly. He does. Yeah.
Yeah. So
And in his office.
yes,
Yeah,
yes,
yeah.
I've heard that. But like, you know, the other thing that happens a lot in society now, obviously across the Western world, and I think probably even in the Eastern world, but I know less about that. But you know, there's this whole kind of like elites versus everyone else
Right.
battle that goes on, and naturally things like this are in the middle of that, understandably so. But like sometimes I try to talk with people who just throw around the keywords. I'll give you an example. Like they'll just say like, "Oh, BlackRock's taking over the world" or something. And my thought more is like, I've seen these companies up
Right.
close. They're enormous corporations. They're people who have emails that be like, you know, I have a hard stop at 5
Yeah,
and stuff like
exactly.
that.
It's bureaucrats.
And right.
Yeah.
And what I try to talk with people about is if you want to talk about where there could be pieces of more sinister, you know, money running the world or things like that, I always say like look at some of the very, very high end private equity firms and like some of the family offices they
Right.
work with, and it sounds like that's
Yeah.
pretty much what you were doing.
Totally, because actually the way into the story was that I found to my first story was that I found this kind of opaque looking website of a German family office, which is called the Harold Quandt Family Office.
Yes.
And they had 18 billion in assets under management, and it turns out that Harold Quandt.
Is that BMW?
So it is BMW. It's two branches of the Quants.
Okay.
They're the main family in my book. One branch controls the BMW group, which is not only BMW, but it's also Mini and Rolls-Royce. And it's two siblings. They're the Germany's or Europe's wealthiest siblings. They have an estimated net worth each of 30, 35, 40 billion. liquid, depending on the market, and and they get each €1 billion dividend every year from BMW, right?
A billion euro dividend.
Yeah.
That'll do.
Yeah, that'll do. That will do. That will do, sir. and there's the other branch, which is the Harold Quandt branch, where Harold Quandt's mother was the late Magda Goebbels, so the propaganda lady of the wife of Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda minister of the Third Reich.
Didn't they kill?
Yes, so absolutely.
And the kids.
So absolutely. Joseph and Magda Goebbels killed their 6 children in the Führer bunker on April 30th, 1945, right? But Magda Goebbels had a child from her first marriage to Günther Quandt, which was one of the biggest industrialists in Germany. And he survived. Harold Quandt survived. He survived as a prisoner of war. He was a paratrooper, and he survived. He was in a British prisoner of war camp in Benghazi, of all places. Yes. Yeah. And he survived, and he and his older half brother, the one who ended up rescuing BMW from bankruptcy and made his family the richest in Germany, they became 2 of Germany's largest post-war industrialists.
And they were Nazis.
And Harold actually wasn't. This is the crazy thing. So Harold grew up in the most fanatic Nazi family, right? I mean, your stepfather is a Nazi minister of propaganda. Your real mother is referred to as the the unofficial first lady of the Third Reich. Hitler is in love with her, but says, I need to be celibate because I'm married to the German people, right? So has this arrangement where Magda and Joseph Goebbels serve as this kind of perfect example of unity to the Germans.
They definitely had a lot of threesomes.
They had a lot of affairs, the 2 of them. They cheated on each other so much, right? But they had these 6 children, and then there was the older. Then there was Harold from her first marriage, who was also this blonde kid who fitted these bizarre Aryan ideals, right? So, but he was just, to put it bluntly, he was kind of a spoiled rich kid who wasn't interested at all in Nazi ideology, and he could get away with not joining the Nazi party because his stepfather was Joseph Goebbels. So he actually ends up becoming a paratrooper for during World War II, and does all these kind of daring behind enemy line drops on the Eastern Front in Italy, you name it.
But he's not a Nazi.
And he's not a Nazi. His half brother, because that's the way I got into the book. His half brother Herbert was a huge Nazi who built, concentration camps in German occupied Poland, who exploited thousands of men and women in a battery factory in Berlin, including female concentration camp captives, from Auschwitz, who acquired companies stolen from Jews in France. Today, BMW has a foundation named after him with the motto, Inspire Responsible Leadership. Herbert Quandt, BMW Foundation, Inspire Responsible. That is the BMW's largest foundation. Like, that is their consumer-facing foundation.
I fucking love BMWs, though. That's the problem.
Okay, well, you won't after this. You won't after this. Believe me. So that was really, that's why the Quandts also became the vocal point of the book, because they are still Germany's most powerful, biggest political donors. It's arguably one of its most prominent car brands globally, right? But they have these 2 branches with these 2 different stories, right? Which make it so interesting.
I'm just curious politically, because the Nazis were fascist right wing. Yeah. Do they donate to right or left wing or everything?
No, they donate now. These families now, or at least the BMW Quandts, as I call them, the one with the Nazi father and grandfather, they donate to the Christian Conservative Party. So it's the Conservative Party, which is like Angela Merkel's party.
Okay.
It was like the establishment. It's like the business establishment party.
Okay, got it.
There's no continuity, as far as we know, with regards to them supporting the far right or the far left or whatever. Well, they want to be. They want to seem. They want to show themselves as being, decent people, quote unquote.
Yeah. I gotcha.
So, so that's what was really. So that discovery of that family office.
That was a website, you said?
It was a website. It's still up. It's like a one-page website.
Can we pull it up?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, for sure. It's like a Harold Quandt family office. HARALD, and then space QUANDT. Yeah,
and then family office. Let's see if we can look at this bad boy. Here, where we protect all our money. And absolutely all of it is 100% legitimate. All right, yeah, that first one. Does that look like?
I think that might be the
first one.
I think that might be the
No,
one.
go back to all.
Yeah.
Go back to all.
Yeah.
Yep. See the first one?
Yeah.
Hit that. Perfect.
Yeah, that's it. That's the one.
Yeah, we have this on. We have it on the screen.
That's the one.
Harold Quandt family office manages the pooled assets of the heirs of Harold Quandt, who passed away in 1967. Furthermore, the Harold Quandt family holds sole shareholdings and respectively one majority shareholding in several financial service companies: HQ Capital, HQ Equita, HQ Trust, HQ Asset Servicing. These financial services companies have a total of approximately US $17 billion assets under management. It's a couple bucks. The core competencies are in the development of global portfolio strategies backed by solid experience in alternative investment classes. There's a bunch of mumbo jumbo to say we're really rich. And this is a lot of
basically.
money.
Yeah, exactly. And we have dozens of people working for us, investigate, including a huge office in New York.
Now, what about, so you just came across this.
I came across this, and then I looked into, because one of my mandates was to look into hidden wealth. And
Bloomberg.
Bloomberg, yeah. So it was family offices, family-owned businesses, non-stock exchange listed, and hidden wealth.
What
basically.
do they mean by hidden wealth?
Hidden wealth is like offshore wealth, like family offices, right? Things that are not, again, the non-listed family-owned companies, the family offices. Kind of wealth that is not, not like the Facebook guys who have an IPO and their shareholding, right? But it's basically what their investment vehicles do. So, it's kind of what goes on slightly behind, what is not known, what you have to dig into, to tell the audience, basically. Not what's in an SEC filing.
So fly a drone over Switzerland, basically.
Yeah, something like that.
Gotcha.
Or send me, your human drone. Yeah, a human drone.
Yeah, how do you go, you're a journalist, a talented journalist. Right. You got the Bloomberg backing. That's great. But how do you even get into places to try to find this stuff? So
Germans are obsessed with the U.S. So which is kind of strange because, well, I would say, most of Western Europeans are, but kind of strange in the sense that, you've also been occupied by for 5 years. But So when I said, hey, I'm a reporter from New York, I work for Bloomberg, like a lot of doors that I think for a lot of German or other European reporters stay closed, opened. That was really the experience because they would love to talk to Bloomberg and they wanted to get exposure, because there's a lot of money here. Maybe they could get some investors because they work with a lot of institutional investors, right? So they get some of that American money sloshing around. Right, so it opened a lot of doors. Actually, that's really what I noticed. If you say, "Hey, I work for Bloomberg. I'm based in New York. I'm coming to Germany," because they're also Germans have this perverse mix of superiority and self-hatred, and so they have this kind of inferiority complex. So when somebody from the when an American reporter goes up and be like, "Hey, I want to talk to you guys," they're like, "Yeah, sure. When do you want to meet?"
So even if it's like a portfolio manager of a major family office,
it's a CEO, CEO of a family office, because they're thinking, it's Bloomberg, they're focusing on investments, they're not going to rake up our entire Nazi history,
I mean, that seems a little short-sighted.
Well, yeah, but I think there is a certain confidence in Germany where they think, they're not. This is all past. I think for a lot of these families, I think this is ancient history. This is like. I think there is also this cognitive dissonance on their side where they think, hey, this is something we dealt with, right? This is,
They donate to the Holocaust Museum, call it
yeah, basically. 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 Yeah, it's just also this implicit whitewashing, right? And then,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, I mean the destruction again, like we said earlier, not that long ago, but I guess you, especially when you're born into money.
Right.
Look, I don't have experience with that. I wasn't born into a
Yeah,
family
right.
office family, but from the outside,
Sure.
seeing other people, there seems to be a cognitive dissonance of you
Totally.
thinking that you earned it. Now,
Yeah.
does that not mean
Totally.
that some of these people who inherit it end up being very well educated and like actually are smart and provide value to the economy? Yeah, some of them do, but they have this thing where they ignore whatever went into that, and in this case, it's like in the most sinister way because we're talking about literal financing of like World War II crimes.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, I understand that though, right? Because, well, first of all, as I've also noticed with working on these people, or reporting on these people, is that the more money there is, the farther one is away from reality, right? Because you're surrounded by yes men and women, and you don't often have people who say no to you or who criticize your decisions, right? So that's already a problem. Now, second of all, of course, they didn't make that money. So their entire identity is kind of shaped as heirs, right? So they stand in the shadows of their fathers and grandfathers. So to kind of go out and publicly disavow them, that would also mean, what is left of your own identity if you're coming out and criticizing the person who, your entire identity is built around on, right? So they find that exceptionally difficult. Thirdly, particularly, but the families are right about, we have these huge consumer-facing companies like BMW and Porsche and Audi and Lamborghini and Seat and Skoda and Rolls-Royce and Mini and you name it.
Wait, Lamborghini's tied up?
Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
They're Italian.
Yeah, I know, but they were bought by the Volkswagen Group. Yeah. I'm sorry. I hate to break the news to you.
All right, continue.
They're so worried about, they have to protect the brands at all costs, right? And to anything, to hurt the share price or the sales or the standing of the brand, they don't, coming out and saying, hey, yeah, okay, the man who made the brand big was actually an SS officer who was trained at Dachau concentration camp. You can't really, or build concentration camps himself, or like is responsible for the mass murder of tens of thousands, or the mass exploitation of tens of thousands. I mean, that's you don't want to have that as part of, or they don't want to have that as part of their corporate history, but it is a fact of life. So I always, I think they should argue for I think they should implement radical transparency is what I'd be arguing for.
I wonder if part of the psychology, because when they're alone in a room, I'm sure, these people know their family history.
Yeah.
And I'll also give the benefit of the doubt to a percentage of them.
Totally.
At least they probably totally disagree with it. They probably think this was horrible.
For sure.
So let's give at least some of them that credit.
Yeah.
But like
most of them, I would say, even.
You ever seen Godfather 2?
I have, yeah.
Okay. So there's a scene early on in that movie where Michael Corleone's in his office and he's talking with that senator from Nevada.
Yeah.
And the senator's like, I don't like your kind. You come out here with your silky suits and olive oil hair. And you know what? This is the last time we're going to deal together. Don't ever call me again. I expect my payment. Yada, yada, yada. And Michael Corleone's sitting there listening, not saying a word, smoking a cigarette. The guy finishes and he goes, Senator, we're both a part of the same hypocrisy. And there's a part of me that when I hear a story like this also has to recognize that, like, okay, these companies that, removing what they did may have made great products and lived on and still make great products today, but have a sinister past. They could sit there and say, well, what about the fact that like America did Operation Paperclip and took all these Nazis in that got you to the fucking moon and, and improved all your science and things like that because they were scientifically talented in that way.
Yeah.
Right? It's like no matter where you turn, you have some sort of very dark past related to 45.
Listen, I mean, I completely agree with you on that, right? I mean, it's not to engage in like whataboutism, but if you look at my own native Netherlands, right, we never like dealt with our like horrific past of colonialism, slavery, and collaboration with the Germans too, right?
What was the collaboration with the Germans? What's the history there?
I would say relative to population, the most people and the most Jews in Western Europe were deported from the Netherlands. and it's only third behind Hungary and Poland, or Poland and Hungary overall relative to population. How many people were deported and murdered? Right?
Was that by force, or
well,
you're
it was
saying
just-
like they collaborated?
Yeah,
like
they
literal
collaborated. They ratted a lot of
Netherlands?
people out. Right,
Mm.
they kept lists. We were more German than the Germans, even though we fashioned ourselves always like, oh, everybody was in the resistance, and that's not something that they didn't try. The Netherlands is still very reluctant to own up to its own past on many levels. I just ended up focusing on the Germans because I'm intrigued. Because it's the third. It's one of the largest economies in the world, right? Third behind the U.S. and Japan. Actually, China's still smaller per GDP, per capita,
per capita GDP.
yeah, per GDP,
Okay, got it.
exactly, yeah. And and it's not doing so great right now, or it is still relative the economic powerhouse of Europe.
Yeah.
It sustains Europe, and politically too, in a way, right? Even though it's a mess politically. So I just focus on the Germans. I do think people are also more interested in reading about the Germans than they are about, I would say, the Dutch. So and these brands, they're global, right? And it's also creating a sense of awareness generally, not only with regard to German products. The money you spend on something, could end up as dividends to these families and go towards the sustaining of a major global foundation named after a Nazi war criminal, right? It is creating a certain sense of awareness, but I would never argue for any kind of, I think people should really choose and do whatever they want. I mean, it's not a call to boycott or something like that. It's a call for transparency.
Yeah.
I think that's a kind of a minimum one can ask for.
How much did you, like in your research, study the denazification period from say 45 to 60?
Yeah, a lot. I mean, it was a major part of it. It was a major part of it because, the families that I ended up choosing, are what are today still Germany's wealthiest dynasties, and I ended up picking 5, and kind of the contemporary criteria were that they had to have global consumer-facing companies and or massive family offices that invested billions globally. So not families like Krupp, like the Steel dynasty, or Thyssen, like the Steel dynasty, which have died out as dynasties. They need to still be, or they are no longer relevant on a global business stage.
Yeah.
Secondly, that these dynasties lived on, right? That there's another generation which can kind of reckon, or that can come clean about the past. And thirdly, that I focus on those with small shareholder groups. So like with the BMW, with the Quandt, BMW Quandt, it's like 2, right? Or with the Porsche Pierre dynasty, it's like a dozen. So they have effective economic control over the policy, over company policy, so they can steer direction. For example, you have companies like Siemens or Henkel, which have 200, 300, 400, 500, 600 family shareholders. So
Wait,
diffuse.
it's that high?
Yeah. So they don't really have a say in their company anymore, right? I mean,
Right.
they can't really steer their companies anymore. So those are the contemporary criteria, which led me to these 5, 6 dynasties in the book. But the historical criteria was A, that they profited from mass armaments production. B, that they profited from the expropriation of business families, whether they were Jewish or otherwise Gentile, either in Germany or in German occupied territories, and of course, thirdly, the mass exploitation of forced and slave labor. An estimated 12 to 20 million Europeans were forced into forced and slave labor, including concentration camp captives, but also millions from Eastern Europe and you name it. And, most importantly, that they got off, by and large, scot-free after the war, these men. And they were all men. And
they were all men.
And they were all men. Yeah, yeah. The industrialists were, the patriarchs were.
Because Germany had it was a very man society back then around the world, but Germany had some prominent women and other stuff too. Like
Yeah.
they
Yeah.
were a little progressive on that.
Right, exactly. Magda Goebbels and Leni Riefenstahl,
yes,
it's
Riefenstahl.
So, so when it comes to denazification, right? I mean, there were these three. So you have the Nuremberg trials, which ended up being for many, the Cold War starts and the Truman administration decides. So the Cold War starts in early 1947, and the Truman administration decides, the Nazis in Nazi Germany, they're all ancient history. We need to rebuild West Germany as a viable economy and as a bulwark against encroaching communism and the Soviet Union and Soviet occupied Eastern Germany. So we need to make Western Germany into a viable economy and into like a liberal democracy, whatever, you name it. So the gaze turns from, punishing Nazis into how are we going to rebuild West Germany. Mm. So the scope of the Nuremberg trials, the subsequent Nuremberg trials became really limited because the Americans didn't want to put capitalism on trial, because it became a war of ideologies.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Because the Soviet Union, which had been part of the first Nuremberg trial, they were now in a battle of ideology.
So
right?
You're saying if I'm understanding correctly, you're essentially saying that means the Nuremberg trials focus literally on the members of the Nazi Party, but not the enabler or those that they enabled around them.
They did, but they were very limited. There ended up being three industrialist trials at Nuremberg against one of my main characters, Friedrich Flick, which later became the controlling shareholder of Daimler-Benz.
Julius Streicher too, right?
Streicher was in the first Nuremberg trial with all the military and political heads.
Okay.
But just business wise, it was against Friedrich Flick and his managers. Flick ran the largest steel, coal, and weapons conglomerate during the Third Reich. Was Germany's richest man in 1933, 45, and again 1960 after having been sentenced to war crimes and crimes against humanity, because the sentence was commuted by John J. McCloy, the American High Commissioner for Occupied Germany.
Why?
Because they needed they needed West Germany as an ally in the battle against communism, and also the Korean War. So it was a decision of political expediency that McCloy let off or commuted the sentences of all the industrialists that were sentenced at Nuremberg, but even more importantly, of many high-ranking SS officers who had murdered hundreds of thousands, who had been sentenced to death at Nuremberg. Their death sentences were commuted to life sentences, and then by the mid 1950s, they were released back on the streets of Germany.
Why were they commuted to life sentences first?
Because McCloy needed to appease West Germany for a variety of reasons. First of all, with the start of the Korean War, first Truman and then Eisenhower enacted the War Defense Act. So American, factories are busy producing for the war, and there's this kind of consumer goods gap, which West Germany is now re-industrialized. West Germany is perfect to kind of fill in and produce these consumer goods. So they become, that brings them even nearer, right? Because that is also, of course, the production of consumer good, important part of kind of also the ideological battle of capitalism versus communism. The then German chancellor says, yes, but you're keeping our men, you're keeping our men locked up on our territory. We want to be your partner in fighting communism. We want to be your partner in the Korean War. We want to be your partner in NATO. We want to have our own army again. But, in order to do that, I think it would be really great if you could release the men that are still being held on our soil, release our nationals that are still being held by you guys on our soil. So McCloy, who was, who was really, politically, again, I say it nicely, I say politically expedient, let's keep it that way.
He reporter,
right, exactly. And he starts, again, first commuting sentences of the industrialist sentenced at Nuremberg, followed by the high-ranking SS officer sentenced to death. Now, of course, some had to be executed. Some had committed atrocities so big or were so, because it was a lot about symbolism, right? If their names were too well known or too much attached to certain crimes or atrocities,
Right.
they were killed. But there were a lot of ones who were kind of, they were, not as well known, and they were the ones whose death sentences were commuted to life sentences were
then
commuted to
released.
and released by the mid 1950s. Yeah, but even those who had murdered, American soldiers, right? Like the Malmedy massacre. You
What was
have
the Malmedy
the
massacre?
Malmedy massacre was a massacre in Belgium in the Ardennes of I think 83 American prisoners of war by
When?
Nazi soldiers in 44, I believe. And the guy who ordered their murder, right? It's of prisoners of war, American prisoners of war. Joachim Peiper, when he was released in 1955 after his death sentence had been commuted, became the head of marketing at Porsche. Was immediately hired off the street, right from death row, right into the marketing director at Porsche.
Another
Yeah.
great car. But why was he? What made him qualified to be a marketing director of Porsche as an SS officer?
Because Ferry Porsche, who made the brand Porsche big globally, was an honorary SS officer, and his his best friend, or one of his close friends, a guy named Joachim Prinzing, the two of them introduced Porsche to the US, where it became a huge hit in the early 1950s. And basically, Ferry Porsche surrounded himself with former high-ranking SS officers in the Porsche boardroom. And his Prinzing, his best friend, was kind of tasked with doing recruiting among former SS comrades to bring them into Porsche. That they were like, hey, if you get released, we have a good position for you, and generally these people were, highly educated, unfortunately highly intelligent, and had a position waiting for them once they were released.
Would you describe Germany? I feel like I know the answer to this question, but I don't want to put words in your mouth. Would you describe Germany today as very, very anti-Nazi, anti their past, if you will?
That's such a good question. I think they, as I said earlier, right, the Germans have this perverse mix of superiority and self-hatred. What they want to do is they want to say it's our history. Like, we did that, we atoned for it. But there is this kind of sense that, they're being still confronted with it day in, day out, right? So in a sense, they're still inundated with also new revelations regarding the history. And they're slightly desensitized in a way to it as well. But I think, in many ways, it's also in a way saying it is our history. We did that, and yeah, they're anti-Nazi, but I don't know. I mean, are they? If you look now, you have the large, Germany swinging very much to the right. I mean, there's a huge, largest opposition party, Alternative for Germany, which
Are
is
they
going
like anti certain groups? And
yeah,
stuff?
they're anti-immigration, anti-Islam, they're anti. They have some anti-Semitic tendencies. They are, they are very much about kind of, they're very much into kind of Holocaust revisionism, and they're very much into kind of, again, whitewashing history. I mean, the end part of my book is also about the rise of the AfD, because one of the members. So you earlier asked about what kind of political parties do these
Yes.
business dynasties support. So there's one example in my book of the family, this kind of aristocratic family, which co-founded Allianz of Munich Re, so the world largest insurers and reinsurers back then and today, right? And they also had this private bank called Merck Fink, and the father, idealized Hitler, became Hitler's kind of main fundraiser for this big museum in Munich, and then was allowed to expropriate the Rothschild Bank in Vienna and the Dreyfus Bank in Berlin as a thank you for his service to the Nazi regime. and his son actually is suspected to be one of the founding funders of the AFD. So that's the one example in my book of a continuation of, of far right support from father to son. But that's really the exception to the rule in these families, right? I mean, that's usually they just support the establishment conservatives.
The reason I ask, or I asked at the beginning of this part of the conversation about the specific, 1945 to 1960 denazification period, and then how it relates to today, is because I haven't spent time in Germany,
right.
But you hear a lot of things about how hardcore, even like legally, they are with not letting some of these ugly things come back through the door, right? Like Annie Jacobsen wrote a book.
Yeah.
Obviously,
Operation Paperclip.
Yes, very not pro-Nazi, opposite, but the cover had a swastika on it, and she couldn't even take it into the country.
So did mine. So does mine. The American edition of my book also has a huge swastika on the cover,
but not the German edition.
Not the German edition, because that's forbidden.
It's illegal,
right? And also, my book in English is called Nazi Billionaires. In German, it's called Braunes Erbe, which means like dark inheritance, basically.
Oh wow! So they even changed the language.
Yeah.
Okay.
But also Nazi Milliardäre doesn't really sound in German, so I think it was also for aesthetic reasons. Yeah.
But point being, you laid it out well. The United States intelligence and bureaucratic regime immediately shifted towards the Cold War and kind of said, okay, let's put this behind us. And therefore, over the next 10, 15 years, they let a lot of people fall through the cracks, if you will, wittingly. Yeah. And some of these people, you've already laid out some examples, but I know there's even more that get into politics, ended up having power in the rebirth of Germany. And these are people who were literally a part of Nazi Germany. So the question is all right, maybe a lot of society is now against Nazism, but they're being led by some people or implicitly changed by some people who have power positions who still believe in them.
Yeah, for sure. And I actually didn't answer your question because the Nuremberg trials were one part of it, but denazification, right? So what ends up happening is that in early 1947, the Americans start handing over thousands of suspected Nazi war criminals and are the Nazi sympathizers who weren't big enough to be indicted and tried at Nuremberg back over to West German authorities for the so-called denazification trials. And of course, there was no incentive on the side of West German authorities to judge their fellow compatriots on crimes that they had committed themselves and on sympathies that they had held themselves. So these denazification trials or committees or proceedings, however you want to name them, quickly devolved into show trials, and not of the Stalinist kind, but of the kind that everybody went scot-free, including many of the industrialists that I write about, who were under the radar, who could have been indicted before Nuremberg, but were just because of the symbolic limitation, because they only limited the Nuremberg trials to 3 industrialist trials. Again, Flick, Krupp and his managers, and the entire executive board of IG Farben. Many of them just went through denazification proceedings and were, deemed fellow travelers, got a 2,000 Deutschmark fine, and their frozen assets were returned to them, and their board positions were returned to them. Yeah, they weren't expropriated at all, except for in East Germany. In West Germany, they could keep everything. In East Germany, they were, of course, by the communists, they were wholesale expropriated, and it all became very good. But the Allies returned everything to them because, again, they want to rebuild West Germany, and for that you need the industrialists, you need the companies going again, you need these large companies as well. As this was part of this kind of bulwark, of this buffer against communism, right? If West Germany is doing well, then communism won't spread, I get behind. I understand those reasons, but where it went horribly wrong was that at least, right, the Allies should have supervised these denazification proceedings and trials, because there was just a continuation of money and power from the Third Reich to West Germany in this kind of vacuum of 5 years between 1945 and 1950, where the Allies could have done a good job of, at least attempting to denazify Germany, because that's really one of the myths that I tried to dispel with this book as well, is denazification never happened. Not only not in the business, not only not in the business world, but on every level of German society, on education, in the legal world, in the medical world.
In education and legal world?
Because all Germans had to go through denazification, and because there was no oversight, it became people weren't properly denazified. So you had judges who were prominent judges in the Third Reich resuming their positions in West Germany, in the new Federal Republic, or you had a Nazi journalist who could continue on without any kind of repercussion or recourse or any kind of proceedings, because denazification failed, because there was no such thing as effective denazification.
To play like slight devil's advocate
Sure.
here, I think I agree with your point, but I just want to
Totally.
is the term steelman this a little bit? We'll figure it out. But is it possible that, judges is a tough one, but let's use the journalist example.
Yeah, sure.
Is it possible that there were some journalists who were Nazi journalists who were completely blackmailed, under the threat of death of their family, to not write what the Nazis told them to write, meaning they actually didn't believe in it, and now, they wanted to report on the other end of stuff?
No, but because if you're already under that much risk, they wouldn't even let you become a journalist. You were barred, right? Because Goebbels made sure, as Minister of Propaganda and Enlightenment, that only people were allowed to be journalists who fully subscribed to the ideals. If there was any hint of doubt, you would be scrapped as a journalist. You couldn't work for the next 10 years.
So you look at it like denazification never happened. One pushback maybe I'd have there, and again, I say this as someone who's never spent time in Germany, so it's a little hypocritical to talk to someone who spent a lot of time there. However, if society, let's say by 1975, didn't feature a lot of people, by percentage, I'm saying, in Germany who still believed in Nazi ideology, couldn't you at least say that some of it worked? We've already laid out all the holes in the system for sure. It wasn't perfect by any means, but some of it got denazified.
No, in a way, it's a process of aging and people dying off, right? But the big cultural class in Germany and in wider Europe was in *68 with the student protests, who started rising up to the generation before them and asking questions. What did my parents and grandparents do during the Third Reich?
What happened here? I don't know much about this.
So '68 was really, there was huge student protests in Germany, in France, you name it, where there was a big clash of cultures between kind of the conservative old guard and the new, hippie-ish, well, not hippie-ish is a bit, pejorative, but people who were concerned with history and saw a lot of things get swept under the rug, or saw their elders not speaking about what they did in the past. And this culture clash erupted, where they were asking for more openness and transparency. And as a result, there was some violent, just like you had here in the U.S., society, SDS, which faction became the weather underground, right? Which did these bombings and these attacks and you name it. In Germany, you had the Red Army faction, for example, which and great movie has been made about it as well. Which killed high-ranking industrialists, or kidnapped high-ranking industrialists or bankers with an SS or a Nazi past.
Whoa!
Yeah.
That's kind of cool.
Yeah. And there's even three generations of them. There's even crazy enough. There's even recently 3 Red Army faction members who had been on the run for, I think, 30 years were recently arrested in Berlin after they'd been living completely undercover.
What, for doing society a service? Jesus.
Right. But they also, they did it with such they did it with such violence. I think there were also innocents hit, and it was
can't have that.
it was and I think the first generation was just kind of had decidedly ideological purity, but then the second and third generation they just sustained themselves by robbing banks and shooting innocent people. So yeah.
During the key periods of the denazification, though, one thing I keep thinking about is obviously there were multiple countries involved in this, and prominently among them the U.S., meaning you had people in these rooms who were involved in prosecutions or processes to put in place who were Jewish as well.
Guys, if you're still watching this video and you haven't yet hit that subscribe button, please take 2 seconds and go hit it right now. Thank you.
So was there like pushback behind the scenes in some of this, paper pushing that was going on from some people? Like, hey, wait a minute, like these guys were killing my people. Like we need some justice here.
Yeah, I mean, I think unfortunately, so few people came back or survived, that stayed in Germany. That those families who did stay, they just kept their head down, and they weren't really, they didn't play major factors of.
But what about like some of the American Jewish lawyers? And there was another guy, I'm forgetting his name, who was not American. I believe he was actually German, but he was like one of the prosecutors at Nuremberg. Like guys like this.
Ben Ferenc, right?
Yeah.
Who became 101, the guy who passed away 2 years ago.
Yes, I believe that's it.
Yeah. This great silence enveloped Germany, or West Germany, following 1950, right? Following denazification, following the establishment of the Federal Republic. And Germany was doing great economically and politically, it became such an important ally to the US. So there was no really need in Germany. Nobody pushed them to talk about it. And even men, brave men like Ben Ferenc or whoever, who did try to make these cases or try to initiate compensation or restitution cases against some of the industrialists. The industrialists like, man, this is history. There's no need. We're free, we're thriving. There's no need for us to have to deal with this, or we're just completely in denial to begin with. So it doesn't really become an issue until the 1990s, when when Germany is reunified, right?
Yeah.
The Iron Curtain has fallen, the Soviet Union has disintegrated. And at the same time, you have two forces happening at the same time. In the US, survivors of concentration camps, but also of forced and slave labor, or both, start filing mass claims against major German companies. And at the same time, you have millions of Eastern Europeans who are freed from the Iron Curtain and from the clutches of the Soviet Union, and saying, well, hey, we lived for 45 years, we're oppressed by the Soviet Union, but during World War II, we were also exploited by the Germans, and we want to have there needs to be some kind of reckoning here. There needs to be some kind of recourse. So what happens is that the Clinton administration in the late 1990s starts negotiating with the German federal government for a compensation for surviving forced and slave laborers. And the settlement that is agreed upon ends up where the German federal government donates 5 billion euros to this compensation fund, to a foundation actually, and German business.
5 billion?
5 billion.
Okay.
5 billion. So about 5 billion USD at the time.
Okay.
And German business as a whole pays up 5 billion euros, 5 billion USD into this foundation. Now, of the money paid by German business, 60% is paid by only 18 companies like BMW, Daimler, Volkswagen, you name it. You name all the big German brands. Thousands of companies have also greatly profited from forced and slave labor, only paying like 500 euros, like a symbolic amount. And then you have the payout to surviving for a concentration camp captive or surviving slave and forced slave laborers is at the highest, is a one-time payment lump sum of 10K. of $10,000. You know, which is a pittance for
Yeah,
what
yeah.
they have what they had to go through.
And what they were robbed of, by the way.
Exactly. And most importantly, what happens is there's a clause in the settlement where the German companies say, well, we don't have to acknowledge any kind of wrongdoing, culpability, or guilt for the crimes that occurred in our factories and mines during the Third Reich. So they pay money, and not very much to begin with. But they don't take any actual responsibility for history. They don't take any moral responsibility for history, right? Because they don't have to acknowledge any wrongdoing.
Thank you guys for checking out this clip. If you haven't already subscribed, please subscribe and hit the like button on this video. It is a huge, huge help. And if you'd like to check out this clip's full podcast episode, that link is in the description below or right here. And finally, you can follow me on Instagram and X by using the links in my description below.